He said the birds were God's cleanup crew, but he gave them plenty to clean. In 1874, deep in the Texas desert, a ranch foreman began feeding travelers to vultures. He called them God's cleanup crew, divine creatures sent to purge the land of the wicked. But as the bodies piled up, the foreman's faith was put to the test. Were the vultures truly acting on God's will, or had he become an instrument of death himself? The line between justice and madness blurred, and soon, it wasn't just the travelers being judged. The foreman would soon learn the truth that his obsession had made him the one marked for cleansing. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, its heat pressing into the land like a hammer, unyielding and unforgiving. The foreman stood at the edge of his ranch, sweat dripping down his brow as he watched the vultures in the distance. They had been circling for days, their shadows stretching across the barren earth, waiting. He didn't know why they came. Perhaps it was because the land had been empty for so long, or perhaps it was the silence of the place, the isolation that seemed to attract death itself. But one thing was certain: something had changed. It was a brutal kind of solitude that ruled the ranch. The foreman had long since lost count of the days, each one blending into the next in a haze of dust and sweat. There was only the land, the dead, and the vultures. The buzzards had always been around, but they had never been this present. It was as if they were waiting for something, drawn to this place like moths to a flame. Then it happened. A body. A traveler had arrived, stumbling through the heat, his face drawn and pale, his clothes torn from the harsh journey. The foreman had no idea where the man had come from. The traveler didn't speak. He barely had the strength to stand. His legs gave out beneath him as he collapsed near the foreman's doorstep. The foreman watched as the man died, slowly, like a candle flickering out. The buzzards, sensing the inevitable, gathered, their wings casting dark shadows on the ground. They were closer, now closer than the foreman had ever seen them. They circled, waiting for the moment when they could descend and feed. The foreman didn't move. He simply watched as the vultures began their feast. But this wasn't just nature at work. This wasn't merely the cycle of life and death. The foreman could feel it, deep in his gut. The vultures were more than just creatures of instinct. They were something else, something divine. He had always believed in God's plan, in a higher purpose to all things. But this felt different. It felt ordained. As the vultures picked at the dead traveler's body, the foreman's heart skipped a beat. God's cleanup crew. The phrase echoed in his mind like a prayer. He had read it once in an old, worn book his grandfather had kept. It spoke of creatures sent by God to cleanse the earth, to rid the land of the unworthy. The buzzards were doing God's work, purging the land of sinners. They weren't just scavengers. No, they were the divine judgment that had been waiting to descend. The foreman had never been one to question faith, but something deep within him stirred. Was this his calling? To guide the buzzards, to feed them and watch as they cleansed the land? The idea felt right, too right, and it wasn't just a fleeting thought. It gripped him, took root in his soul, and suddenly the land didn't feel so empty. The buzzards weren't just circling in the distance anymore. They were here, a sign, a symbol of divine justice. The foreman's chest tightened with purpose. This was his responsibility. Days passed, and the foreman's ritual began. Whenever a traveler crossed his path, whether they were lost, dying, or dead, he would leave their body for the buzzards. At first it felt necessary, like a burden he had to carry. The vultures fed on those who had wandered too far into the unforgiving desert, on those whose lives had been claimed by the harshness of the land. But then it became something more. The foreman started to see patterns. Some travelers were chosen. He couldn't explain it, but he could feel it. The buzzards weren't just feeding indiscriminately anymore. They were waiting for the right ones. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, a group of travelers appeared on the horizon. They looked different from the others, well-dressed, clean, their eyes filled with fear, their footsteps dragging. They seemed to know something the foreman didn't. They were wary, almost as if they had heard the stories. They had heard of the buzzards. The foreman watched them as they approached, their faces drawn with exhaustion. There were 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women. They asked for water, their voices desperate and cracked. The foreman hesitated, but then offered them shelter. After all, wasn't it his duty to help those in need? That night, as the travelers slept under the roof of his ranch, the foreman sat by the window, watching the buzzards circle above. He felt a strange chill in the air, a sensation he couldn't shake. The buzzards were still out there, waiting. He watched them with a sense of reverence, as if they were waiting for something. But who would be chosen tonight? The answer came before dawn. One of the women, who had been sick and weak from the journey, died in the night. Her breath slowed to a halt. and the foreman watched, heart racing, as the buzzards, drawn by the scent of death, began to gather in the sky. They circled, their wings like black sails against the darkening sky. The foreman didn't move. He stood there watching. Was this part of the plan? He wasn't sure, but he knew the buzzards were the ones who would decide. They were the hand of God, the instrument of judgment. They had come to cleanse the land, and yet something didn't sit right. Why had she died? Why was she chosen? She wasn't a sinner. She was just a traveler caught in the unforgiving desert. But there was no time to question it. The buzzards were descending. As the creatures began to feed, the foreman's thoughts raced. Could he really be doing God's work? Was he truly serving a divine purpose, or was he just feeding the vultures? The thought gnawed at him. He had seen the other deaths, the other travelers. But this one felt different. But there was no time to reflect. The buzzards didn't wait. They descended quickly, efficiently, tearing into the woman's body, their beaks ripping through flesh as if it were nothing more than meat. The foreman stood frozen, watching the scene unfold before him. Then, with a sudden jolt, something inside him snapped. The birds weren't just here to feed, they were here to judge. The foreman stepped forward, heart pounding. As the vultures tore through the body, his mind raced. What had he done? Was this truly what God wanted? But it was too late. He had already become a part of something far bigger than himself. The Buzzards, God's cleanup crew, had come, and now they would take whatever they wanted. This was only the beginning of the foreman's descent into madness. The more he fed the buzzards, the more he would become entangled in their divine judgment, and he wasn't the only one who would be judged. The days dragged on in the Texas heat, the sun beating relentlessly against the parched earth. The foreman had become accustomed to the oppressive silence, the stillness that had settled over the land. It wasn't just the buzzing of flies and the distant caw of vultures. Anymore, it was as if the whole ranch had been claimed by something far darker. The foreman couldn't shake the feeling that the land was waiting. The travelers came and went. Some stayed for days, others barely lasted an hour. They were all the same, trudging through the blistering heat, looking for a place to rest, their eyes filled with desperation, and with each one the foreman fed them to the buzzards. He saw it as part of the ritual, an offering to the land, a way to fulfill his purpose. Every time a body was devoured by the birds, the foreman's connection to them deepened. But the more he fed them, the more unsettled he became. It wasn't just the travelers who were being consumed, it was the land itself. The crops withered, the trees shriveled, and the soil grew barren. It wasn't just the desert's heat taking its toll. No, something else was happening. The foreman began to notice the land changing, becoming more hostile. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if it was filled with something foul, something that had taken root deep in the earth. The buzzards, however, grew stronger. The more the land decayed, the more the birds seemed to thrive. At first, the foreman thought it was a coincidence. After all, the land had always been unforgiving. But then, the pattern became undeniable. The more bodies he fed to the buzzards, the darker the land became. It was as if they were feeding not just on the travelers, but on the very soul of the ranch. Each death seemed to take something from the earth itself. The soil grew more sterile, and the once vibrant horizon now felt cold, lifeless. It wasn't just the land that seemed cursed. The foreman's dreams had turned into nightmares. Every night he would lay in his bed, drenched in sweat, and hear whispers' voices, too faint to understand, but clear enough to send chills down his spine. The buzzards circled in his dreams too, their eyes glowing red with hunger. They spoke to him, their beaks clicking in rhythm as if speaking in some unholy language. He could never remember the words, but the feeling stayed with him. They were waiting for something more. One night, unable to sleep, the foreman went out into the night, his boots crunching over the dry ground. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. He stood on the porch, staring out over the expanse of his ranch, feeling the weight of something ominous pressing against him. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A lone figure appeared on the horizon, a traveler. The foreman's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual to see wanderers passing through, but this one felt different. There was an unnatural stillness to the way the man moved, as if the land itself had bent to allow him to pass. The foreman squinted, watching as the man drew closer. The traveler's eyes were empty, hollow, like two black pits. His skin was pale, and his clothes hung off him as though they had been through countless storms. He looked dead, the foreman's stomach twisted in unease. The man wasn't breathing. There was no sign of life at all. And yet, he walked toward the ranch, his footsteps dragging through the dirt. The foreman stepped forward, reaching out to stop him, but the man didn't respond. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the foreman's presence. Instead, the traveler simply kept walking, his eyes locked on the foreman, as if they were the only two beings in the world. Suddenly, the air shifted, becoming colder. The foreman's breath fogged in front of him as the man drew closer. The foreman's heart pounded in his chest. Something wasn't right. He could feel it deep in his bones. This was no ordinary traveler, this was something otherworldly. And then, as if on cue, the buzzards appeared. They were not in the sky this time, but on the ground, emerging from the shadows like a swarm of black ghosts. They surrounded the traveler, their eyes gleaming with a strange hunger. The foreman backed away, his mind racing. What was happening? The traveler stopped in his tracks, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice was like dry leaves in the wind, raspy and cold. "It's not just the land that's cursed," he said, his voice echoing in the foreman's mind. "It's you. You've brought this upon yourself." The foreman's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" The traveler's empty eyes fixed on him. "You fed them. You fed the buzzards. But you don't understand what you are feeding. They're not divine. They're the land's reckoning. They come for the souls you think you've saved. They take everything." Before the foreman could respond, the buzzards swarmed. The man was lifted into the air, his body torn apart by the ravenous birds. The foreman watched, paralyzed, as the traveler disappeared into the chaos. The buzzards devoured him with a ferocity that took his breath away, their wings blocking out the moonlight. It wasn't long before nothing was left but bones and the scent of decay. The foreman stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. What had he done? He turned, desperate to run. But as he looked back, he saw something even more horrifying. The land, once dry and desolate, had transformed. The soil was dark, wet, almost alive. It churned beneath his feet, as if it were breathing. The ranch was sinking into the earth, slowly, piece by piece. The more bodies he fed to the buzzards, the more the land fed on itself. The foreman turned and ran, the sound of the buzzard's wings still echoing in his ears, the ground beneath him shifting and cracking as if the earth itself was reclaiming him. The foreman's nightmare was only beginning. The land was alive, and it wasn't just his sanity that was at stake. His very soul was now bound to it, and the buzzards were waiting for him to make his next move. The foreman awoke to an unfamiliar stillness, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, the kind that makes your skin itch. He lay there in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, a cold sweat clinging to his back. Something had shifted. The air felt heavier, like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. The buzzards had been more active than ever, circling relentlessly overhead, casting long shadows on the earth below. But today, there was something different about them. They weren't just hovering in the sky, they were waiting, watching. The foreman couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. The deaths, the sacrifices, had all seemed justified, part of a divine plan. But the land around him was changing. His ranch was no longer the place it had once been. The soil was turning black, the crops were withering, and the very air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The more he fed the buzzards, the more the land seemed to give way under his feet. The moment he stepped outside, the oppressive heat hit him like a wall. The sky was cloudless, the sun beating down mercilessly. He squinted against the brightness, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, he saw the buzzards still circling, still waiting. But today, something in the way they flew unsettled him. They weren't just scavengers anymore, they were watchers. And the foreman realized with a sudden jolt of panic that they had been watching him all along. He had always believed they were divine, that they were sent to cleanse the land. But now, as the birds circled above, he began to wonder if they weren't divine agents of punishment after all. What if they were here for him? What if the foreman wasn't meant to feed them, but to be fed to them? Shaking off the thought, he moved toward the small shack where he kept the supplies. The wood creaked beneath his boots, each step echoing in the empty silence. He needed to gather more water for the well. The travelers would be passing through soon. But as he walked, the unease crept back, gnawing at the edges of his mind. The previous night's events still haunted him, the traveler, the one who had come from the horizon, speaking of curses and reckoning. His words echoed in the foreman's mind, growing louder with each passing moment. You fed them. You fed the buzzards. But you don't understand what you're feeding. They're not divine. They're the land's reckoning. The foreman had brushed the words aside, thinking them the ramblings of a dying man. But now, in the cold light of day, they didn't seem so easily dismissed. He needed to focus. There was work to be done. The foreman turned away from his thoughts, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. But as he approached the well, something caught his eye. There, by the water's edge, was the corpse of a Wamana traveler who had arrived earlier that morning. She was pale, her face twisted in an expression of pain, as if something had taken her life with a single violent blow. The foreman froze. This wasn't a natural way of things. The land had claimed her, but not like this. This wasn't a peaceful death. This was something far darker. He dropped the water jug and approached the body, kneeling beside it. Her eyes were wide open, but they weren't looking at him. They were staring into something else, something he couldn't see. The buzzards had already circled above, but they hadn't touched her. They hadn't come down to claim her. What was happening? As the foreman reached out to close her eyes, a shadow passed over him. He looked up, and there, in the sky, he saw the buzzards circling lower than ever before. They weren't just hovering anymore. They were diving, their beaks outstretched, ready to strike. And yet, something inside him stirred a feeling of dread that made his stomach churn. Before he could react, the woman's body lurched. Her limbs jerked as if the very earth had grabbed hold of her, pulling her back to life. The foreman jumped back, his heart racing. He had seen many deaths in his time, but this was something he could not explain. The land was cursed, but he had never seen it do this. The woman's eyes snapped open, and she gasped for air, her chest rising and falling erratically. She wasn't dead. Not anymore. The foreman stumbled back in terror, his mind reeling. The buzzards were no longer circling, they were diving toward the woman. But they didn't feed. No, they hovered, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for the woman to rise from the dead. And then, in the space between breaths, the woman spoke, her voice hoarse and cracked. "They are here. They've always been here." Before the foreman could respond, the woman's body collapsed again, this time lifeless once more. The buzzards descended in a flurry of wings, their screeches deafening as they began to feast. But this time, the foreman didn't move. He couldn't. He stood there, frozen, as the vultures tore into the body. This wasn't divine justice, it was chaos. And for the first time, he realized that the buzzards weren't just a tool of judgment. They were the cause of the land's curse. They were not here to cleanse the earth. They were here to consume it. The foreman's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves. A man on horseback appeared in the distance. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his face weathered by the sun, his eyes hard and cold. He rode toward the foreman with a purpose. "Is this your land?" the man called, his voice rough but commanding. The foreman didn't answer at first, too stunned by the scene unfolding before him. But the stranger didn't wait for a reply. He dismounted from his horse and approached the woman's body, eyes narrowing as he took in the buzzards. The man looked at the foreman with a mix of pity and something darker. "Tell me, do you know what you've done?" the man asked. The foreman could only stare, his mind spinning. What had he done? The stranger pointed toward the horizon, where the land stretched on, endless and barren. "You fed them," he said. "You fed the buzzards, and now they will take everything." The foreman's heart stopped. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. The curse was real, and now it was too late. He had unknowingly invited the buzzards to destroy everything. "Get out," the stranger said, his voice low, "while you still can." But the foreman didn't move. His feet were glued to the ground, as if the earth itself had claimed him. The buzzards circled above him, and in the back of his mind, he could hear the whispers against the voices from the night before. The land was breathing, and it was hungry. The foreman had seen the truth, but there was no escaping it. The buzzards were more than just death. They were the reckoning, and they had come for him. The foreman's world was slowly unraveling, each thread pulled tighter by his own actions. Every day the buzzards circled, more numerous than ever. They no longer seemed like creatures of the earth, they were something more, something far darker. He had fed them, yes. He had believed in their purpose, their divine duty. But now, as the land around him grew more desolate, as the dead piled up, the foreman's faith began to waver. He tried to dismiss the feeling, the creeping unease that gnawed at him. It wasn't doubt, he told himself, it was just the weight of the task. The land was cursed, yes, but he was merely carrying out God's will. The buzzards weren't just scavengers. They were sent to purge the earth, to cleanse it. He had seen the signs. He had felt the divine presence in the air, in the wings of the birds. It was all part of the plan. But something had shifted. The buzzards no longer felt like divine agents, they felt like executioners, and worse, the foreman began to wonder if he too was being judged. What if the birds had been sent not just to cleanse the earth, but to judge him as well? It was a night like any other when the foreman stood at the edge of the ranch, staring out at the horizon, the buzzards circling overhead. The sky was a deep, unsettling red, the air thick with the promise of something terrible. He could feel it in his bones. The land was alive, breathing with an energy he couldn't understand. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice he recognized, but one he'd never expected to hear again. "Is it really true?" the voice asked. The foreman spun around. Standing before him was the preacher, the same preacher he had seen in his visions, the same preacher he had heard speak in his dreams. The man had been dead for years, the foreman knew that for certain. He had buried the preacher himself in the soil of the ranch, far from any town or church. But here he stood, as real as the land beneath his feet, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with an unsettling sadness. "Is what true?" the foreman asked, his voice trembling. The preacher smiled, though it was a sad, hollow smile. "That you're doing God's work, that the buzzards are his instruments. You've been feeding them, haven't you?" The foreman swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've been feeding them," he admitted, "but it's for a purpose. They are here to cleanse the land, to rid it of the unworthy. I'm just helping, the preachers." Smile faded. "And what makes you think you're worthy of that purpose?" The question hit the foreman like a blow to the chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The truth, the one he had refused to acknowledge, was there, hanging in the air like the buzzards themselves. Had he truly been doing God's will, or had he been fooling himself, allowing his own madness to guide him? He had believed in the birds, in the judgment, in the purpose, but what if he was wrong? The preacher's ghostly form began to fade, his figure growing translucent as if the very air itself was swallowing him. "You've been feeding them because you're afraid," the preacher said, his voice fading. "Afraid of the land, afraid of the truth." Before the foreman could respond, the preacher was gone, vanished like a mirage, leaving only the heavy silence in his wake. The foreman stood frozen, his mind racing. Afraid of the land? He had always known the land was harsh. He'd always known the frontier was a place where only the strongest survived. But this was something else. What had the preacher meant? What was the truth he was so terrified of? The foreman turned his gaze to the buzzards overhead, their black wings cutting through the air like a storm. He could feel their eyes on him, burning into him. Were they waiting for him to make a choice? Were they here to purify him too? He had fed them, but what if the real sacrifice was yet to come? What if he was the one meant to be cleansed? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement in the distance. A figure another traveler emerged from the edge of the ranch. This one was different. This one seemed to be drawn to him, moving purposefully, as if guided by something unseen. The foreman's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could it be someone sent to test him, to see if he was truly doing God's work? Or was it another reminder of his own guilt? The figure approached. As the foreman stood there, waiting, the traveler stopped just a few paces away. The man was tall, his clothes torn and dusty from the journey. His face was lined with age, his eyes filled with something darker than fatigue. He looked at the foreman with a knowing gaze, as though he could see through him. "You've been feeding them," the man said, his voice low and rasping. "The buzzards. But you've been feeding them for the wrong reasons." The foreman blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the foreman's. "You think you're serving a higher purpose, but you've been feeding them out of fear. Fear of what's coming. Fear of yourself." The foreman's throat tightened. The man's words hit him harder than the preacher's ghost ever had. "Fear of myself?" The traveler nodded slowly, his eyes dark with understanding. "The buzzards don't just take the unworthy, they take those who are too weak to face the truth. You're afraid of what the land has become. And so, you've fed the birds, thinking they will save you from it. But all they're doing is feeding on your fear." The foreman stepped back, his heart racing. Could it be true? Had he been using the buzzards as an excuse to hide from the truth? Had he been feeding them out of fear, not faith? But before he could respond, the buzzards above let out a deafening cry, their wings beating in unison. The foreman's head snapped upward, his heart pounding in his chest. The sky had turned black with the swarm of birds, their shadows darkening the land. And then something changed. The ground beneath his feet shifted, cracking like dry earth breaking under pressure. The foreman's eyes widened as the earth itself began to move. The ranch, the land, the very soil, it was alive, and it was reaching for him. The traveler stepped back, his expression grim. "You're not just feeding them, are you?" he whispered. "You've become part of it. The land is hungry, and so are you." Before the foreman could respond, the earth buckled beneath him, pulling him down. The ground opened up like the mouth of a great beast, swallowing him whole. The foreman had begun to realize the truth about himself, but there was no turning back. The land had taken him, and the reckoning had only just begun. Would the buzzards finally claim him, or was there something far worse waiting for him in the depths of the earth? The ground was alive beneath the foreman's feet, the earth trembling with a force he couldn't explain. The crack that had opened up beneath him seemed to grow wider, swallowing the land whole. His heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled backward, his legs weak and unsteady. The buzzards above seemed to sense the shift in the earth, circling faster, their cries louder and more ominous. The foreman's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing. He had done this. He had invited this curse into the land. The traveler's words echoed in his ears. The land is hungry, and so are you. He was trapped. The land, the buzzards, the earth itself, they were all feeding on him. And the more he tried to flee, the tighter the grip on his soul became. He turned, ready to run, but the earth was no longer just dirt beneath his feet. It was a vast chasm, a void that seemed to stretch into the abyss. The foreman's heart lurched as he realized the depth of his mistake. The ranch was no longer just his home, it was a prison, a place where the land itself had claimed him. He had become part of the curse. He ran, his feet pounding against the dry, cracked earth, but no matter how far he went, he couldn't escape. The buzzards were always above, circling, their hungry eyes tracking his every move. The land itself seemed to be pulling him back toward it, as if it had tasted the blood of the dead and wanted more. His breath came faster, his chest tightening with every step. The foreman reached the edge of the ranch, his eyes searching for any sign of salvation. In the distance, he saw the outline of a cabin he hadn't seen before. It was dilapidated, its walls crumbling, but it stood there, looming, like some sort of twisted sanctuary. Without thinking, the foreman ran toward it, desperate for any sort of refuge. As he approached the cabin, he stumbled over a mound of dirt. The ground was soft, too soft, and when he looked down, he saw the bones, human bones. They were scattered everywhere, half buried in the earth. The foreman's heart stopped. He recognized them. These were the remains of the travelers he had fed to the buzzards. He fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he touched the bones. What had he done? He had believed he was fulfilling a divine purpose. He had believed the buzzards were God's agents of judgment. But now, as he gazed at the remains of the dead, he realized the truth. The buzzards weren't cleansing the land, they were feeding on it, and he had been feeding them. A cold wind howled through the empty cabin, rattling the broken windows. The foreman turned and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was the traveler, the one who had warned him, the one whose eyes had been empty, hollow. The figure stepped into the cabin, its eyes fixed on the foreman. "You've been feeding them," the traveler said, his voice low and guttural. "And now the land has claimed you." The foreman tried to speak, but his words caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of the truth pressed down on him like a stone. He had been the one to awaken the curse. He had been the one to bring the reckoning to this land. The traveler moved closer, his steps slow and deliberate. "The buzzards, errant agents of divine justice," he continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "They're the land's judgment, and now you're part of it. You've fed them, and now they will feed on you." The foreman's heart raced. He had believed the land was cursed by the dead, but now he understood. The curse wasn't from the travelers, it was from the land itself. It had always been here, waiting, hungry for the souls of the living, and the buzzards were its instruments, feeding on the weak, the desperate, and the guilty. As the traveler's figure loomed closer, the foreman could feel the earth beneath him shift. The ground was moving, shifting like water, pulling him in. The bones of the dead seemed to rise from the earth, reaching out to him, as if they too were calling him to join them. His heart raced in terror, and he stumbled backward, away from the mound of bones. But it was too late. The earth opened wide beneath him, and he felt himself falling, deeper and deeper into the abyss. The buzzards were above him now, their wings blocking out the light. Their cries filled his ears, louder and louder, as if they were coming from every direction. He could feel their hunger, their insatiable need for death. The foreman's breath caught in his throat as he fell, and then, in an instant, the ground gave way completely, and he was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the cold grip of the earth, the weight of the soil pressing down on him. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The buzzards were waiting, their wings beating in the air, their eyes glowing with hunger. But then, something strange happened. The darkness began to shift, to change. He could feel the earth moving around him, pulling him, shaping him. It wasn't just the land, it was the curse itself. The foreman's body began to twist and writhe as if the earth was consuming him, reshaping him into something else. His limbs grew heavy, his skin began to crack, and the very air around him grew thick with the stench of decay. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but there was no escape. The curse had claimed him, the land had claimed him, and there was no going back. As the earth swallowed him whole, he realized, too late, that the reckoning had always been for him. The land had never been cleansed, it had been devouring him all along, and now he was nothing more than another victim of the curse he had awakened. The foreman had finally come face to face with the land's hunger, but the worst was yet to come. The buzzards had fed, but the true reckoning had only just begun. And as the earth closed in on him, the foreman realized that his greatest nightmare was not the death he had invited, but the living nightmare he had become. The foreman's world was drowning in darkness. The land had claimed him, and now it was tightening its grip. The air around him was thick with the stench of rot, and the ground beneath his feet felt soft like flesh, like something alive that was consuming him from the inside. He could feel the earth shifting, groaning, as if it were breathing him in. The buzzing of the vultures, once distant and omnipresent, now sounded like a choir of demons, their wings beating with terrifying rhythm. Every part of his body screamed for release. His limbs felt heavy, his skin cold and clammy. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to understand what was happening. What had he become? The earth was swallowing him whole, and the truth was finally crashing into him with unbearable force. He had fed the buzzards, he had sacrificed so many to them, but it was never about divine cleansing. It was never about God's will. The buzzards were not God's agents, they were the land's reckoning, and he had been the one to awaken it. He stumbled, falling to his knees, the weight of his guilt almost too much to bear. As he lay there, gasping for breath, the ground beneath him quaked. The sound of bones snapping and flesh tearing echoed from all sides. His mind raced. Was this the end? Was this what he had been destined for all along? To become one with the land, to be devoured by the very curse he had unleashed? Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Ita figure, a shadow in the distance moving toward him. His heart skipped a beat as he strained to make out the shape. It was a person, or rather, it looked like a person, but the foreman knew better than to trust his eyes. Nothing had made sense for so long. Nothing was what it seemed. The figure moved closer, and the foreman's pulse quickened. As it drew nearer, he recognized it, the same traveler he had seen before, the one whose eyes were hollow, the one who had warned him. But this time, the man looked different. His body was decayed, his flesh rotting, his clothes torn and weathered, yet somehow he was still moving, still alive, or at least what passed for alive in this twisted land. "You," the foreman croaked, his voice barely a whisper. I thought you were dead." The traveler's hollow eyes fixed on him, and for the first time, there was something in his gaze, as something recognizable. There was pity in those eyes. "I was," the man said, his voice rough, like gravel scraping against stone. "But you brought me back. You all did. The land claims what it needs, and it doesn't care what happens to the rest of you." The foreman's mind reeled. Had he really brought this man back from the dead? Had he, in his desperation, allowed the earth to reclaim him in such a grotesque manner? "You fed them," the traveler continued, his voice growing softer. "And now they're feeding on you. But it's not just the land that's hungry, it's the curse, and now it's your turn." The foreman's heart pounded as the weight of the traveler's words sank in. This wasn't just about feeding the buzzards, it was about feeding the land itself. It was about appeasing something far older and darker than anything he could understand. The earth had claimed its due, and now it was coming for him. "What do you mean?" the foreman gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "What do I have to do?" The traveler took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the foreman's. "You can't run anymore," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "You can't escape what you've started. The land is alive and it's feeding on your fear. The buzzards are just the beginning. You've fed them your guilt, your fear, and now they want more." The foreman's stomach churned. More? What more could it want? The traveler's eyes darkened. "It wants your soul." Before the foreman could respond, the ground beneath him split open with a violent crack. His body was jerked forward, and he felt himself being pulled into the earth. It was as if the land itself had come to life, pulling him down, dragging him deeper into the darkness. His hands scraped at the soil, but there was nothing to hold on to. The earth was alive, consuming him, pulling him into its depths. He screamed, his voice lost in the cacophony of buzzards' cries and the grinding of the earth. The last thing he saw before he was swallowed whole was the traveler, his decayed face twisted into a grotesque smile. And then there was nothing but darkness. The foreman didn't know how long he had been falling. The earth swallowed him whole, the ground shifting beneath him like quicksand, pulling him deeper and deeper into its depths. The buzzards were no longer above him. They had left him behind, their cries fading into the distance. But the land, it wasn't done with him. Not yet. He could feel the earth pulsing. Around him, the darkness closing in. His body felt heavy, as if the weight of the land itself was pressing down on him. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of confusion, guilt, and terror. Had he really brought this upon himself? Was he destined to be consumed by the land, to become part of the very curse he had unleashed? Suddenly, he stopped falling. The ground below him solidified, and he found himself standing on something hard and unyielding. He looked up and saw nothing but darkness, the air thick with the scent of decay. "You wanted to save it," a voice echoed in the void. The foreman's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. It was the preacher, the same one who had appeared to him in his dreams. "I didn't mean to," the foreman stammered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. "You didn't mean to," the preacher's voice mocked, though it held no malice. "You didn't mean to feed the land? You didn't mean to feed the buzzards? You didn't mean to give in to your own fear? But you did, and now you're a part of it. The land, the curse, the reckoning." The foreman fell to his knees, his heart pounding in his chest. He had believed he was doing God's work, but now he saw the truth. The land wasn't cursed by the dead, it was cursed by him. He had fed the earth his guilt, his fear, and now it was taking everything. And there was no escaping it. "You can't hide from it," the preacher continued, his voice growing softer. "The land has claimed you, and you will be its servant for eternity." The foreman closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. The land had taken everything, and now it was taking him. The foreman had finally understood the truth of the curse, but the land was not done with him yet. The reckoning was far from over, and the buzzards were still circling. The land had consumed him. The foreman had no doubt of that anymore. He had fed the buzzards, fed the earth, fed his own fear, and in return, the land had taken him into its dark, unforgiving embrace. There was no escape, no refuge. The earth was alive, and it had marked him as its own. As he wandered through the suffocating darkness, the foreman's thoughts raced. He could feel the earth shifting around him, the ground pulsating with a hunger that mirrored his own. He had sought redemption, tried to control what he had awakened, but now he realized that the land would never be satisfied. The buzzards weren't just creatures of death. They were agents of the earth itself, sent to carry out its will. The foreman's body felt heavy, his movements slow as the land drew him deeper into its grasp. Every step felt like a weight dragging him down, and the air around him was thick with the stench of decay. The very soil seemed to writhe beneath his feet, alive with some terrible force that could not be understood. He had become part of it, part of the curse that had slowly consumed the land and all who had crossed it. And yet, despite the weight of his fate, the foreman refused to give in. He had spent his life struggling to survive, and now, in this final moment, he clung to one last hope. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to undo the damage he had done. In the distance, he saw it, the altar. The sight of it made his heart race. The altar was nothing more than a rock formation, jagged and raw, but it was surrounded by an eerie glow. It was a place of power, a place where the earth's hunger could be appeased. He could feel it, deep in his bones. This was where it had all begun, and it was here that it would end. The foreman walked toward the altar, his legs trembling beneath him. Every step felt like an eternity, but he pressed on, driven by the desperate need to make things right. He had to make things right, for the land, for the travelers, for himself. As he reached the altar, the ground beneath him trembled once more. The earth seemed to open, cracks running through the soil like veins. The buzzards circled overhead, their wings beating in a dark rhythm, their cries louder than ever before. The foreman knelt, his knees sinking into the soil, and for the first time, he looked up at the sky. The darkness seemed endless, the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating him. In that moment, the foreman understood. The earth didn't want his blood. It didn't want the lives of the travelers he had sacrificed. It wanted something far worse. It wanted his soul. "Take me," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "Take me and end it." The earth rumbled, and the buzzards screamed. In unison. The foreman's body jerked forward as the ground pulled him deeper. He could feel the earth wrapping around him, its grip tightening. His skin burned as if the very soil were burning him from the inside out. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But then, as if the land itself had heard his plea, something shifted. The earth trembled once more, but this time it was different. The pull of the land was no longer suffocating. It was gentle, almost comforting. The foreman opened his eyes in confusion, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked down at his hands, and to his shock, they were no longer covered in dirt and grime. They were glowing. A soft golden light was emanating from his skin, radiating outward like a beacon. He gasped, stunned by the sight. "This is it," a voice said, soft but powerful. The foreman's head snapped up, his heart skipping a beat. It was the traveler, the one who had warned him, the one whose hollow eyes had followed him every step of the way. But now the man was different. He wasn't decayed anymore. He was whole, alive. The foreman staggered back, disbelief washing over him. What's happening? The traveler smiled, his face serene, almost peaceful. You've chosen, he said, his voice filled with an understanding that made the foreman's blood run cold. You've chosen to make the sacrifice, not of your body, but of your soul. The foreman's mind raced. Sacrifice his soul. He had given the land everything, his labor, his life, his guilt, but he had never thought he would have to give up this, the very essence of who he was. No, he whispered, shaking his head. I can't let go. I need to fix it. I need to undo it. The traveler's expression softened, and he stepped closer to the foreman. You cannot undo what has been done. The land has claimed you, and it will claim everything else. But by letting go, be offering yourself fully to the earth, you can give the land what it needs, and in return, the curse will be broken. The foreman's breath caught in his throat. Was this the end? Was this what he had feared all along? To become one with the land, to become a part of the very curse he had set in motion? You're not just feeding them, the traveler continued. You're feeding the earth, and in return, the earth will give you peace. The foreman looked down at his hands again, the glowing light still radiating from them. It wasn't burning him. It wasn't tearing him apart. It was soothing him, like the earth was finally accepting him. He had always feared the land, always feared the buzzards. But now, as the earth wrapped around him, he realized it wasn't the land he feared. It was his own guilt, his own madness. The foreman closed his eyes, his heart still pounding, but now with a strange sense of clarity, he understood. The land wasn't his enemy. The earth wasn't punishing him. It had never been about divine judgment, it had always been about balance. The curse was a way to restore that balance, to return what had been taken. And now, it was his turn to give back. With a final breath, the foreman opened his hands, letting go of his soul. The light from his body intensified, blinding him for a moment, but when it cleared, he felt different, lighter, at peace. The earth rumbled once more, but this time it was gentle, a soft hum beneath him, like the land was breathing in time with him. The foreman stood, and as he looked up, he saw the buzzards circling in the distance. They weren't watching him. They were flying free. They had fed, and now their work was done. The curse had been broken, and for the first time in his life, the foreman felt no fear. The land had claimed him, but it had also released him. The curse was broken, and the foreman was free. But what awaited him in the light of his sacrifice? Could peace truly be found, or would the earth's hunger return? The foreman stood still, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath his feet. The golden light that had once radiated from his body was now dimming, flickering like the last ember of a dying fire. The buzzards, once circling relentlessly above, were now at rest. Their dark wings cast long shadows over the barren land, and the foreman could feel the weight of their gaze upon him, as if they were waiting for something. He was no longer the man he had once been. He had sacrificed himself, given his soul to the land, and yet despite the peace that had settled over him, he felt a deep unease. It was as if the earth was testing him, watching him closely, waiting for him to prove something. The land had taken his guilt, his fear, and now it had given him peace. But the buzzards had not left. They were still there, watching, circling as though they were waiting for a final judgment. The foreman glanced over his shoulder. The traveler, the one who had guided him, the one who had shown him the truth, was gone. But something about the emptiness in the air felt heavier, as if a presence lingered, unseen but undeniably felt. He stepped forward, his feet light, almost weightless as he crossed the threshold of the land he had once tried to control. The earth was soft beneath his steps, the ground no longer hard and unyielding, but welcoming. Yet as he moved, a strange sensation washed over him. The earth didn't feel like home. It felt like a cage, a place that had swallowed him whole, and now that it had gotten what it wanted, it was done with him. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound, a harsh flapping of wings above. The foreman froze. He looked up, his heart lurching as the buzzards descended once again. Their wings were massive, dark shadows that blotted out the sky. But this time, something was different. This time, they weren't circling aimlessly. They were diving toward him, their beaks open, sharp as knives. A rush of fear shot through the foreman's chest, but he stood his ground. Was this the final judgment? Had he done enough? Had he given enough to the land to be truly free? Or was this simply another step in the endless cycle of death? The buzzards swooped down, their bodies silhouetted against the sky, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The foreman's pulse quickened as the first of the vultures landed in front of him, its eyes gleaming with a cold, unblinking hunger. The creature stepped forward closer, and in its eyes, the foreman saw the truth. The buzzards were not here to judge him. They were here to remind him of what he had become. The sacrifice had not been enough. No matter how much he gave, no matter how much he tried to atone, the land would always demand more. The buzzards had been feeding, but they would never be full. The foreman's breath caught in his throat as he understood. The land didn't want peace. It wanted to consume. It didn't care about redemption or sacrifice. It only cared about taking. But before the buzzard could strike, the foreman's vision blurred. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the earth seemed to shift. The foreman fell to his knees, his body convulsing as the soil wrapped around him like a vice. The buzzards flapped their wings frantically, but the earth was pulling him in, dragging him deeper into the earth's belly, as if it had finally come for him truly, fully, completely. The foreman screamed, but no sound came. His arms and legs were pinned by the earth, his body sinking into the soil. He was being swallowed whole, consumed by the very land he had tried to appease. The soil beneath him turned to mud, slick and suffocating, as the earth tightened around him, like the jaws of a beast. The buzzing of the buzzards grew louder, deafening, until it consumed everything. The foreman's eyes were wide with terror as the earth pulled him down deeper into its dark heart. But then, just as he thought the earth would swallow him entirely, the buzzing stopped. The ground beneath him stilled. He opened his eyes, gasping for air, and looked around. The earth was no longer moving. The buzzards had disappeared. The land had gone quiet. And then he understood. The land had been testing him not for his soul, but for his truth. The sacrifice had not been about appeasing the earth. It had been about confronting himself. The land did not want his blood, nor his fear. It wanted his honesty. It wanted him to see what he had become. It wanted him to accept that no matter how much he gave, no matter how much he tried to atone, there would always be more to give. There would always be something left to take. The foreman slowly rose, the soil falling away from him, the weight of the land lifting. The earth had let him go, but it had also shown him something deeper, something more sinister. He had been part of the curse all along. He had fed the buzzards and the land because he was trying to outrun his own demons, but the earth had always known the truth. He had never been in control. The land had always been the one in charge. The foreman staggered to his feet, his body trembling with the weight of everything he had learned. The buzzards were gone. The land was still. And yet, the curse wasn't truly over. There would always be another cycle, another soul to be claimed, another sacrifice to be made. But this time, the foreman understood. The land didn't want his fear. It didn't want his blood. It wanted something much worse. It wanted him to keep feeding it, to keep feeding the cycle. The foreman took a deep breath, letting the quiet fill his lungs. He looked around at the empty land, at the dust that hung in the air, and for the first time he saw it for what it truly was. The curse wasn't just the land. The curse was him. The foreman had confronted the truth, but was it too late? The land had freed him, but it had also marked him. The buzzards were gone, but the cycle was far from over, and the land would always be hungry. The foreman stood alone on the edge of the land, the vast desert stretching out before him like an endless ocean of sand and dust. The buzzards were gone. The earth was still. The silence pressed down on him like a weight he could barely carry. Everything felt different now. The land that had once been oppressive, suffocating, now felt empty, as if it had drained him of everything it had wanted and was now leaving him to face the consequences alone. He could feel the weight of his choices, the truth of them, hanging around him like a cloud. The land had consumed him, tested him, and in the end, it had set him free. But what kind of freedom was this? What was the point of surviving all these years just to realize that the curse had always been inside him? The truth hit him all at once like a hammer to the chest. The land had been hungry, but not for blood. It had been hungry for something deeper. The earth wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a land of dust and death. It was a reflection of him. For all the travelers he had fed to the buzzards, for all the bodies left behind, the land had shown him that it wasn't the earth that needed to be cleansed. It was him. He had fed it with his own guilt, his own fear, and in return, it had taken him, shaped him until he could no longer tell where the land ended and he began. He had believed he was doing God's work, but the real work had always been his own. The foreman sank to his knees, his body shaking, the weight of the realization almost too much to bear. He had done everything for the land, everything to appease it, but it wasn't enough. It had never been enough. and now the land was empty, hollow, a reflection of his own soul. "You've learned the truth, haven't you?" The voice came from behind, cold and detached, but oddly comforting. It was the traveler, the one who had guided him, who had shown him the curse, the one who had warned him. But now, the traveler didn't look as he had before. His eyes were no longer hollow. They were full of something else, something darker, something that seemed to know more than it should. The foreman turned slowly, his heart pounding. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice a whisper. The traveler stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the foreman. "You've been feeding it, but the land is not satisfied. It never will be. The curse doesn't end with your sacrifice. It doesn't end with the buzzards or with the land. It ends with you." The foreman blinked, confusion clouding his thoughts. "I've done everything. I've given everything." "No," the traveler corrected, his tone sharp. "You've been trying to escape yourself. And the land reflects what you refuse to face." The traveler's eyes darkened. The reckoning was never about the land. It was always about you, and until you accept that it will never be over, the foreman's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The traveler's voice softened. "The land can't be cleansed because you're not trying to cleanse it. You're trying to escape it. The land is not evil. The buzzards are not agents of God. They're the consequence of your denial. You've been feeding the earth your guilt, your fear, your desire for redemption. But none of it is real. It's a cycle, and it's never been about what you've done. It's about what you've refused to acknowledge." The foreman felt something snap inside him, like the breaking of a dam. For so long he had believed that he was a servant, a tool in a larger plan. He had believed he was fulfilling a higher purpose. But the truth was that he had been running from himself. He had been feeding the buzzards, feeding the earth, in an attempt to redeem himself, to undo the wrongs he had done. But there was no redemption for someone who refused to face their own darkness. The foreman closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his sins, the weight of the land, pressing down on him. For the first time, he wasn't afraid. For the first time, he understood. The land wasn't cursed because of the buzzards. It was cursed because he had been too afraid to confront himself. The curse was his own, and the only way to end it was to stop running. As he stood, the earth seemed to tremble beneath him, but this time, it wasn't pulling him down. This time, it was releasing him. The soil no longer felt suffocating, no longer felt hungry. It felt still, at peace. The traveler stepped back, watching him closely. "You've broken the cycle. The reckoning is over. You've faced what you've been running from, and now the land can heal." The foreman took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly. He felt lighter, emptier, but in a way that was freeing. The weight of his guilt, his fears had been lifted. The land was still, the buzzards were gone, and the curse that had plagued him for so long was finally over. The earth was not his enemy. It had never been. It was simply a reflection of everything he had been too afraid to face. "I understand now," the foreman whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't the land. It was me." The traveler smiled, nodding slowly. "And now you are free. The land is no longer hungry." As the foreman stood there, looking out at the barren land, he knew one thing for certain. The curse had been broken out by the buzzards, not by any sacrifice, but by him. He had finally faced the truth, and in doing so, the land had finally healed. The reckoning was over, and for the first time, the foreman felt a peace that had eluded him for so long. The foreman had confronted the darkness inside himself and broken the cycle. But was it enough? Had the land truly healed, or was there still something lurking in the shadows, waiting to claim him once again? Final payoff. The foreman walked away from the land, leaving behind the curse that had consumed him for so long. The buzzards were gone, and the earth, once hungry and oppressive, was still. For the first time in his life, the land felt like land, not a prison. The cycle of death had ended. The reckoning had passed. The foreman had faced his own darkness and broken free. As he disappeared into the horizon, he knew that the land would never be completely free of hunger. The buzzards could return. The earth could call for more souls, but not his. The foreman had finally broken the cycle, and in doing so, he had become something else free. The land would remain, waiting for the next soul to walk its path. But for him, the curse was over. The buzzards had left, and now he was the one who would never return.